pastor friend told me about a missionary friend his church supported, and he noticed the missionaries seemed to be gone from the field and back here in the States quite a bit. When he contacted the missionary supporting church, he found out that the missionary had recently been arrested here in the United States. The missionary had been out to eat at a restaurant and publicly attacked his son with some cruel, angry words. Two ladies who were sitting 2 tables over moved to the other side of the restaurant, and about a minute later, one of the ladies came over to the missionary's table and said to him, "Sir, you must respect that child." The missionary then asked her what she said, and again she said, "I said you must respect that child." With that, the missionary, with a boisterous, angry voice, said, "Get out of here." Then a second time he said, "Get out of here." And a third time he said, "Get out of here." She left, went back to her seat. When the missionary and his family got up to leave, she approached him again and said, "I'm calling the police." I'm reading now from the letter the missionary wrote where he said, "I told her in a loud voice, it's not my job to respect my son, but to love him," which is not exactly accurate, but I don't really have time to explain it. He said, "Go ahead and call the police and I will wait." When the police came and investigated, the officer informed the man that he had disturbed the peace and he arrested the preacher. When the case went to trial, the missionary pleaded guilty to a disorderly conduct charge, though he felt that he was not guilty, but he wanted to just put the whole issue behind him. The problem had consumed 3 months of his life dealing with his lawyer, the district attorney, the court system, and all of that. When the mission board responsible for the man found out what had happened, they asked the missionary to resign, but left the decision to the sending church's pastor, who graciously asked that they be allowed to put the missionary in counseling for 6 months and see if they could help him. I was traveling in the northern part of the United States several months ago now, and a pastor friend told me this story, and immediately my heart was really grieved and saddened. And after a day of not being able to get it out of my mind, I went back to the pastor and I said, "Pastor, this is up to you. I'd be willing to give you a full set of my anger DVDs if you'd like to send them to this brother. Maybe they could help him if he would watch them." So the pastor looked at me and said, "Brother Davis, I think that is a wonderful idea. I would be delighted to call him and talk to him about this and then send him the DVDs as a gift." So I prayed, and I'll share more of that story later in the message. A godly wife and mother in our church in Illinois, that is the picture of the Curran family with 10 children, asked me a while back a wise question. The question was preceded by an observation. She said, "Pastor Davis, I've noticed that you often bring up the issue of anger when you speak. May I ask you, what do you do when something bad happens that you've not planned for? What do you do with the initial feeling of anger?" I believe the text that I'm going to share with you tonight gives the answer to her question. Would you notice that Ephesians 4:26 and 27 has 4 distinct steps downward that follow each other into a dungeon of defeat? Would you read these off the screen out loud with me? Everybody, would you please? And notice the numbers as you read. All together. "Be ye angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath, neither give place to the devil." Now watch my hands here. Step number 1, be ye angry. Step number 2, and sin not. Step number 3, let not the sun go down upon your wrath. Step number 4, neither give place to the devil. Now allow me in this introduction to alliterate those 4 steps in those 2 key verses. You could call these 4 steps downward into anger bondage or anger addiction. Step number 1, stirring. Step number 2, sinning. Step number 3, settling. Step number 4, signing over. Read those out loud, everybody, would you please? Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Oh, you're really taking part tonight. Thank you so much. Makes it easier to preach. Now notice that it says, "Be ye angry," and it means be ye angered. It is describing a stirring that happens inside your soul. The Greek verb tense is a present passive imperative, and the passive tense means not that you're acting, but that you're being acted upon. It is saying that they're coming unexpected bad things you have not planned for, which will stir in you the emotion of anger. This is not sin. That stirring is God's flashing yellow caution signal, telling you that you better slow down. Decide to let the Holy Spirit lead your spirit so that you respond with patience and love and kindness instead of sinning by getting angry. Now, if you do not heed the caution of the stirring and calm your heart, then you will wind up sinning. Be ye angry. The second phrase is, and sin not. You and I never have to engage in anger either by our words or our actions. Verse 29 just below this says, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. Why? Because that's where anger usually shows up first, usually with the words that we say. I never look at that picture without thanking God I didn't marry that woman. Verse 31 says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger be put away from you. Now, some people go so quickly from stirring to sinning that it's almost like they skip the first step completely. Have you ever noticed that? That is why we're told in Proverbs 14:29. Read it with me, everybody, would you please? He that is hasty of spirit exalteth folly. 10 times in your Bible, it is seen as a godly thing to be slow to anger. If you slow down when the stirring comes, then you'll be more likely to act instead of reacting with anger. Now, steps number 3 and 4 warn of even greater danger. First, we have the stirring. You can stop that. When they had the sinning, if you're in the sinning, then you need to confess right then. And if you don't, and you're not careful, you can move to the third step of settling, where it says, let not the sun go down upon your wrath. When the sin of anger is not quickly confessed, then it turns into what Proverbs 21:24 calls proud wrath that settles into your soul as you sleep and permeates your entire being. Now, when I was studying for this message and got to this point, I asked myself the question, what else in the Bible did God say should not be left overnight? Pastor, by the way, you can almost make a whole sermon with several points out of the answer to that question. But the one that came to mind for me right away was in Deuteronomy 21, where it said that if a man had committed a capital offense and was to be put back to death by hanging, that his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, that thy land be not defiled. Do you see the principle? That offense and that anger have to be buried, or it will defile your life like a decaying body staying around. Bury the dead body of anger, or your bedroom will become a breeding ground for bitterness. Read it with me, please, everybody. Bury the, or your bedroom, stirring, sinning, settling. And the fourth one here is signing over. Neither give place to the devil. It is saying that you sign over a room, a spot, or an area of control of your life to the devil. You give the devil place or ground in your life. You say, well, I would never intentionally do such a thing. But intentional or unintentional, if you sin by getting angry, then you let it settle, then the next step that you take downward automatically is to sign over. And remember, this is written to Christians, not just to lost people, primarily to Christians. Now follow carefully my next thought, because it is really the message. If anger is an area where Satan gets control, then maybe we can understand this area better by understanding and comparing it to another area where Satan has very clear control. And a key area in the New Testament where Satan was seen to have control was in relation to unclean spirits. So what similarities or comparisons might we make between unclean spirits and anger? And now you know why I call this message the demonic-like nature of anger. And the first comparison that I noticed between anger and unclean spirits is that there's an obvious shame that seems normal to the angry person, but is shocking to those who are around that angry person. You remember in Mark chapter 5 and Luke chapter 8, Jesus was in the country of the Gadarenes. And when he went forth to land, there met him out of the city a certain man which had devils a long time and wear no clothes. Now folks, that is shameful. Isaiah 47:3 says that when nakedness is uncovered, that shame is seen. Don't you wish somebody would tell Hollywood that? This man felt no shame when he should have felt shame, and angry people will often publicly display their anger and have no shame with it. A preacher friend told a story from his childhood. He said, there was a dog in our house. It needed to go to the bathroom, but it didn't know how to say, I need to go to the bathroom, so the dog went to the bathroom right in our house. My daddy got up, picked up the dog, went outside, grabbed his hind legs, and bashed his head against the wall, then came back inside and ate a big bowl of ice cream like nothing had ever happened at all. Now, I'm talking about that there are many that should display shame, but they have no shame. Secondly, comparing unclean spirits and anger. For many, their anger problem began in their youth. In Mark 7:25, we read about a mother whose daughter, quote, had an unclean spirit. Now, I'm not claiming to understand all this. I am simply reading to you the Bible. In Luke 9:42, for a father's only son, Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the child. Several different times I've had some parent come to me and say, what do I do with my child? It's like he's just mad at the world in general. He's always getting angry. All somebody has to do is bother his toys, put some food on the table he doesn't like. He just gets screaming mad. Well, I think for many children, anger is manifesting itself because of their sin nature. How many here tonight have a sin nature? Let me see your hands. That's all of us. And that means this, any of us can get angry at any time. In fact, any of us could display any sin at any time, and none of us should ever feel haughty or proud or boastful like we've raised ourselves above everybody else. And yet at some time, a child has to be taught that he's responsible for his attitude and his actions. But then it is also true that many children are angry because they have been provoked to wrath by their parents or by somebody else. But you notice what is happening here. This man is not really spanking his child. He is using a belt, which is really a whip. The Bible says that the whip is for the horse's back. It is not for the child's back. If you're going to discipline a child, and I really go into this in the parenting series entitled The 3 Key Elements of Successful Parenting. I also have a whole message on a whole DVD on the subject of spanking. But if you're going to spank a child, do it the right way at least. And that means you don't use a belt. You don't use your hand. The hand is an object of love. You don't use a board or a paddle. The Bible word is very consistent. The Bible word is rod. It is a rod. It is always a rod. A rod and reproof give wisdom. The rod of correction shall drive it far from him. And it is a little thin limb off of the tree. I would suggest you have the child himself go out and get the limb that you need. And when you spank a child the wrong way, you provoke a child to wrath. You fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. Fathers, provoke not your children to anger. I gave this message several weeks ago in a church, and a preacher came up to me and he said, Brother Davis, I looked that up in the Greek, and he said, it is really, really interesting, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4 in the Greek. He said, the provoke not your children and the word wrath are the same Greek word twice in a row. Do not, and the meaning is, don't wrath your children to wrath. Don't use your wrath to make your children angry children. Now, this is the only time that the word discourage is used in the entire New Testament. And God is very concerned in particular that children don't get discouraged. The number one way godly committed parents lose their children's hearts is by expressing anger at the child. Then then Satan is able to step in because the heart is gone. Satan is able to step in and win over the child's heart. In the message, How to Win the Heart of a Rebel, I explained that the key ingredient in raising good children is to get their hearts early, be extremely vigilant to keep their heart and not lose their heart. And if at any point in time you ever lose a child's heart, then you go back and find out where and when you lost it and do anything you have to do. And I do know what I said when I said anything. Do anything you have to do to win the child's heart back. A mother lost her temper, grabbed her little boy by the arm and said, "Son, the devil's got a hold of you." The little boy looked up at his mama and said, "Mama, I think you're right. I think you're right." Now, a new study from October 2011 said that children can learn anger and aggression from their parents at a very early age. They found that babies only a couple of weeks old could pick up on the bad behavior of the parents, but I think it would go back further than that. I think it would even be true of babies in the womb. They studied a group of 67 high-risk mothers looking at interactions with their babies during feeding times, and they noted that mothers who showed disgust in their facial expressions, spoke in a harsh tone, or handled their babies roughly had children who acted out years later in kindergarten and first grade. He said the children who had experienced a more negative environment as infants were the same ones the teachers were saying were showing greater oppositional and explosive behaviors. If you've heard my other messages on anger, especially the one I referred to a while ago on freedom from the spirit of anger, I talk a lot about this verse, Romans chapter 12, verse 19. Read it out loud off the screen, everybody, would you please? Dearly place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Now there's a simple principle that is really obvious in that verse, and that is this: the purpose of wrath is vengeance. When you get angry with your child and you discipline your child in anger, you are not truly correcting the child. You're carrying out vengeance on the child. Vengeance belongs to God, not to you at all. Now, here's one of the problems with anger. And in fact, if you'd like to see it, you can go to our Solve Family Problems Facebook page. And we posted a video just a couple of weeks ago on how to correct a child without getting angry. The problem we have is this: anger is indeed a very powerful tool. Anger really will work. Anger works to control disobedient children. Anger works to bring order to a disobedient group. All you got to do is scream. All you got to do is get mad. And the anger creates a fear that stops the problem that you see going on. The problem though is this: the anger itself is wrong. The anger itself is sin. You are fighting wickedness with wickedness, and you do not overcome evil with evil. You overcome evil with good, and God is very clear about that. And you and I are never handed vengeance. God doesn't allow you and me the luxury of vengeance. God says that is for Him alone. Now, the thing is this, though. Vengeance is not always simply a physical thing. Humiliation is another form of vengeance. Do you ever see anybody just deliberately try to humiliate somebody in order to get even with them? Do you remember the story in the Old Testament of how Hanan, the king of Ammon, humiliated David's servants by cutting off their beards and also cutting off part of their clothes that left their nakedness exposed? Hundreds of thousands of men went to battle over that, and tens of thousands of people died. Pastor, I've thought about it. I'm not sure there is ever a time when a Christian should humiliate any other person. Stop and think about that, would you? We are not even supposed to rejoice if our enemy is humiliated. A lady wrote an advice column this, and she said this: I'm worried about my husband's relationship with our 5-year-old son. My husband and son do not talk, play ball, or anything else I expect a father and son to do. The only thing my husband does consistently is criticize, yell, and belittle. Notice that word, belittle. He will call my son a baby. He'll tell him that he's acting like a girl. My son will get upset. My husband will taunt or spank him instead of comforting him. My son has recently begun saying, that he doesn't love his daddy, doesn't care about him, and wishes he were not in our home. Is this going to create any long-term problems for my son? And obviously it is. I would say to teachers and children's workers here, don't ever do anything to deliberately humiliate a child. It'd be better to just send the child home. I know what it's like. I was a pastor. We used to have a bus ministry. For over 30 years, I dealt with a bus ministry and all the problems that come with all of that kind of thing. And sometimes you're tempted to embarrass or humiliate somebody to regain control and to bring that person back in line. It'd be better long range. And Christians are supposed to always look at long-range fruit, not short-range fruit. It'd be better to just take the child aside and say, we love you and we want you to come and I'll check with you in 6 months. Right now I'm going to have to take you home. You're just to the point that we cannot control you. Now notice this. God can righteously get angry. God can righteously carry out vengeance. God can righteously even humiliate somebody. He did it when he made King Nebuchadnezzar like a wild animal for 7 years. I promise you, he was humiliated. I'm not sure if God deliberately tries to humiliate somebody. In fact, preacher, if you got any thoughts on this, I'd love to hear them, because I really don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether God deliberately tries to humiliate somebody or if his punishment or correction sometimes simply does that. Because this Nebuchadnezzar was such a proud man, declaring he built that great city of Babylon. Then God smote him, and he was smiting his pride. What happens when God humbles a proud man is that often he does humiliate him. I've had people come to the table, look at our anger series, and ask us the question. Now wait a minute. You got 10 DVDs in the anger series, but I see that 3 of them have to do with pride and humility. It is because we discovered that if you don't deal with pride, you can't deal with anger. They really are locked together. And if you don't help somebody with their pride, if they do not humble themselves, then God will wind up humiliating them. So, notice this. God can righteously get angry. God can righteously carry out vengeance. God can righteously humiliate somebody. But you and I are not God. And we better leave. See it? Say those 3 words, everybody, please. Anger, vengeance, humiliation. We better leave those 3 things to God. You better just keep your hands off of all 3 of those things. In the message, Freedom from the Spirit of Anger, I did an intensive study on the 7 key words in the Bible. Anger, angry, wrath, wrath, fury, furious, and indignation. I studied every one of those and found out that 80% of the uses of those words in the Bible, I counted every one of them, 80% were God's anger. were always righteous. The other 20%, were man's anger and were always unrighteous. Notice, third comparison between anger and unclean spirits is that an angry person may flip suddenly from being normal to displaying wrath. Luke 9:39, lo, a spirit taketh him, and he suddenly crieth out. People are often shocked and dismayed, to see an angry person display his anger. How many of you have ever been shocked to see somebody who just did like that all at once? Just like, wow, where did that come from? That's what happened in that restaurant with that lady in my opening story. She was shocked to see that man talking to his son like he was. In fact, part of the charge against the missionary was that he used profanity in a public place, which he denied. But I know exactly the words he said, and I would not dream of saying them publicly. And I see why the authorities defined it as profanity, and he was declared guilty of disturbing the peace by using profanity in a public restaurant. A lady wrote me and she said, I've been under the burden of an anger problem for many years. It's a generational sin. My husband was fed up with my snappy responses, but I defended myself. 10 years ago, when my children were 2 and newborn, I went forward in our morning service asking forgiveness and for prayer. The people who counseled me said, oh, you're doing fine. Then she says, oh, how I wish somebody had helped me with my spirit of anger. He could have saved my children 10 years of living under a loving mother who could turn at a moment's notice. Even now, she said, I try to justify my anger is not as bad as some other people's, and yet I know that it is not the truth. If I scold my 12-year-old son, he will scold his 10-year-old brother, who in turn gets angry with the neighbor boy or becomes whiny. Anybody recognize the picture of this man? Who is that? That is John Paton, the famous missionary. If you've never read his biography, it's great personal or family reading. I suggest that you get his autobiography and read it out loud together. The stories of his life are really interesting. John Paton told about a schoolmaster he had when he was a boy, not quite 12 years of age. He said the teacher was in some respects kind and tender-hearted. He bought John Paton a new suit of clothes because he noticed that he didn't have any nice clothes, gave them to him secretly. He taught John Paton to pray. But John Paton in his book said this, and I quote, all of my teacher's influence was marred by occasional bursts of fierce and ungovernable temper amounting to savagery. Once, after having flogged me unjustly on my return, only at my mother's entreaty, he ran at me again. He kicked me. I fled in pain and terror from his presence and rushed home. And when his passion subsided, he came to my parents, apologized, pled with me to return, all in vain. Nothing would induce me to resume my studies there. Undoubtedly, at that time, I had a great thirst for education and a very retentive memory, which made lessons comparatively easy. And as there was no other school within my reach, it was at a great loss that my heart shrank from this teacher. He had a teacher who would flip and go suddenly from being normal to displaying great wrath. Now, I was talking about how anger can be compared to unclean spirits. When I was discussing this with somebody, they said to me, are you saying that all angry people are demon-controlled or demon-oppressed or demon-possessed? And the answer is no, but many may be. What the Bible does say clearly is that the person who becomes angry gives Satan some type of control in his life. A fourth way that anger can be compared to unclean spirits is loud screaming is common to them both. In Luke chapter 4, verse 33, the unclean spirit cried out with a loud voice. Mark 5:7, the Gadarene demoniac cried with a loud voice. A man who had an anger problem said to me, I used to think I wasn't getting my point across at all unless I was screaming at the person I was talking to. Did you ever see anybody like that? Angry people don't really communicate, because they're not following what Ephesians says when it commands to speak the truth in love. Now I want to paint a picture for you here. All right? I don't know whether you can hear this or not, but you got a storm going on here. Love. I'll just stand over here a little closer where you can pick it up from my microphone. For you here. All right? I don't know whether you can hear this or not, but what? Was that coming from? Oh, is that up there? It's in your system. Oh, okay. All right, you scared me. I was trying to figure out what happened. I thought, wait a minute. You know, I hate it when a preacher competes with me in preaching. You know, especially when it's me. I don't think I've ever had that before. I don't like that guy, whoever he was. All right, here we are. There's a storm. The wind is blowing. The rain is pouring down. The lightning is flashing. The thunder is rolling. And you are standing out in the middle of that trying to carry on a normal conversation with somebody. Can you do it? The answer is no, you cannot. Why? Because you are focused on trying to survive the storm. An angry person, your mate, your children, your workers, they don't hear you. You can scream louder and louder and louder, and they are not going to hear you. They are focused on trying to survive the storm of your anger. Have you ever seen a child being screamed at by his parents? He locks down, braces. He's bracing for the wind, the lightning, the rain. He doesn't hear anything the angry father or mother is saying. It just goes right past him. He is trying to survive the storm. He is trying to live and survive and live for another day without the tornado of his father's anger wiping his life completely out. The fifth way anger may be compared to unclean spirits is that the angry person often damages himself worse than anyone else. In Mark chapter 5 it says, and always, night and day, that Gadarene demoniac, he was in the mountains. He was in the tombs. He is running. He is screaming. He is cutting himself. He is crying out. And a pastor, why? What's going on here? He damages himself worse than anybody else. A pastor in Texas called me. And he said, Brother Davis, I want to tell you that I apologized to my church last Sunday for my anger. And he said, a man came to me on Wednesday, showed me his bloody fist and told me that he'd gotten angry and slammed his fist in some glass that broke and smashed his hand. A mother wrote this. She said, I need some advice. Please help me. My 17-year-old son got so mad that he hit his head on his car windshield and broke it. Now, I don't know whether she's talking about the head or the windshield. I think she's talking about the windshield. She continued, he wrecked my new car by driving in the desert over ruts and curves and brought it home on a tow truck. He asked me not to be stressed out, but how can I not be worried about him? He broke his windshield with his fist. Charles Spurgeon said, anger is temporary insanity. I read another article telling what anger does to the body. It said, the emotion of anger causes the blood to rush from the stomach to the limbs and to the brain. It increases the heartbeat and strains the blood vessels. And even the healthiest of persons cannot stand this indefinitely. No one, unless under distress of terrible circumstances, would willingly shorten his own life. Everyone who frequently yields to anger may rest assured he is shortening his own life. A sixth comparison between anger and unclean spirits is anger has caused at times the angry person to lose everything. Apparently the demoniac left behind a lot to go live in the graveyard. In Luke 8, after Jesus healed him, the man begged Jesus to let him go with Jesus. And in verse 39, Jesus said, return to thine own house and show how great things God hath done unto thee. That word house probably meant his home where his family was. The same Greek word in Acts referred to everybody in a house. Anger has cost many people their family, their friends, and their finances. And anger itself is a destroyer of relationships. Now, I want you to look very carefully and study the picture on the screen in front of you and read the statement with me, please. Everybody out loud. If you have a marriage and an anger problem, if you don't correct the anger problem, then you can't correct the marriage problem. Now, look at that picture. Talk to me here. Does this couple have a marriage problem? Does he have an anger problem? Can they fix their marriage problem if he does not first deal with his anger problem? It's impossible. Cannot be done. Study the next picture. Read the statement with me, please. Everybody, if you have a... Now, my guess is, looking at that picture, that he's got a rebellious teenager on his hands. He's got a juvenile on his hands who is, having all kinds of struggles and all kinds of problems. But she has a daddy who is angry. Now, can he help her with her problems unless he first deals with his problems? The answer is no, he cannot. In fact, that's what people try to do. Pastor, I've had them. You may have had them as well. Bring this rebellious teenager, set him down in front of you and say, fix my kid, and tell you all the children, all that child's problems. And you know what? If you could fix that kid, and the honest truth is, you could. And you can fix that kid a lot easier than you can fix that parent. All over America, there are these homes scattered all over the country. I know many of them. Florida, South Carolina, Iowa, Indiana, several other places. And it's a home where you can take a child who is rebellious and they will turn your child around for you. But the director of one of those homes, a home in Iowa, said to me just a few weeks ago, Brother Davis, you are so on target. We cannot, once we get the child straightened out, we cannot send the child back home. He said, what you're doing with your DVDs is more important than what we're doing. Because he said, if you don't get the parent turned around, you cannot really help the child. Some of those homes, the director of one of those homes told me, he said, we try. He said, sometimes we will keep the child in our home until they are ready to graduate from high school and go straight to college. He said if they go straight to college instead of going back home, he said they can make it. If they go back home, they don't make it. What happens is this child, you see, the child has only had this problem with this rebellion for about 3 years. I have a message entitled, What to Expect from a 12-Year-Old. Well, I explained the 7 key character qualities that a 12-year-old should have by age 12, and you completely defuse the teenage time bomb. Excuse me, when the child is not where they're supposed to be by age 12, then it takes about 3. The number 3 is very significant in the Bible. It's a number of completion. And it takes about 3 years for you to have a full-blown rebel on your hands. So about age 15, sometimes 14, sometimes 16. By about age 15, you got a full-blown rebel on your hands. And they're trying to figure out what to do with this child. And you know what they want to do? They want to start with the child. But Luke chapter 1 verse 17 is very clear. You do not start with the child. You start with the parent. It says, turn the heart. He shall go before him in the spirit and power of Elias to turn the heart of the fathers to the children. You start with the parents. And the disobedient, that is the child, to the wisdom of the just. When the parent becomes just, which is which is the opposite of being unjust, when he ceases to be unjust and becomes a just parent, then the child will cease his disobedience and rebellion. And the rest of the verse says, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. So the child is not ready. He is not prepared for God to work in his life until his heart is turned from himself to his parents, and the parents must be just. But children turn around very quickly. If parents do what we tell them to do, rebellious teenagers will turn around in 2 weeks or less. It's not unusual at all. Parents, that's a different story. In fact, we tell parents, don't try to do that. There's a message on the table back there. That one message will almost turn around a rebellious teenager. Very, very strong message to young people. It's entitled, My Son, Give Me Thine Heart. Do not take that video and play it for a rebel. If you play it for a rebel and they turn around, they won't stay turned around unless their parent has turned around. And the child's had this problem for 3 years, and the parents had this problem for 20 years. And it's become a part of his or her very being. I mean, this anger, this spirit of anger, it is something that they just continually manifest. And that child is discouraged, becomes discouraged and defeated, and says, you know what? There is no way at all that I can do right. I just throw up my hands and quit. A leader of a church told me how they had lost their pastor. Somebody recommended a preacher from a neighboring state. The man seemed to be a solid man with a good wife and children. He had 9 children. He came and preached. The church was considering calling him. He stayed several days. During one of their meetings with him, they were shocked. You remember how I said a person will flip and suddenly become angry? He flipped. They heard him get angry, lose his temper, speak harsh words. When he was approached about it later, he became defensive, and the church decided they better look somewhere else. And several months later, the man telling me the story told me he found out the preacher and his wife had divorced. 9 children left without a dad and mom together in the home, and it really went back to that man's anger. A man with an anger problem gets himself in a situation where he wants to take action to help his children, because many angry men love their children, but they get themselves in a situation where they cannot take action when they need to take it. We counseled a while back with the family of a pastor who had 3 daughters, ages 23, 18, and 11. And he just found out that the 18-year-old was planning to go to a movie theater with the 23-year-old guy she had just met, her dad had never met, and knew nothing about. Now, I know the world thinks nothing about that. If you're a Christian, that alarms you. He went to his daughter and said, now, honey, you cannot go. And she said, sorry, Dad, I'm going anyway. And he got angry and blew up at her. And his wife then got upset at him for getting angry at his daughter. What had happened was he'd been angry so much over so long a period of time that it caused his wife to become defensive of the children, and the children would have been defensive of the mama. I actually deal with that in the message, The High Cost of Anger, where I explain a key verse in relation to anger and how if you deliver an angry man, you're just going to have to do it again. And a wife will reach the point where she delivers her husband over and over and over again, and she'll reach the point she can't deliver him anymore. Now his marriage is damaged, his relationship with children is damaged, and now that this daughter is 18 years old, because of the anger, there is no heartstring tied between him and the daughter to keep the child in line. And his anger rendered him helpless to be able to protect his daughter. A 7th comparison between anger and unclean spirits is the angry person loses control of himself, and becomes controlled by his anger. The demon-possessed people of the Bible were under the control of the demon. The demon would use the man's mouth to speak with. According to Mark 5:4, the demon would give to that demoniac supernatural power to break the chains that were put on him. He was under the control of the demon. How many times has an angry person been referred to as losing control of himself. A famous preacher from the 1700s referred to his impatience and anger as a ferocious wild beast that I have never been able to conquer. Now, anyone who will can stop the anger from going forward while it is in the stirring stage. Once you yield to anger, you will no longer control it. It will control you. Here is also a major difference between the anger of man and the anger of God. In Jeremiah chapter 6 verse 11, God says that He is weary with holding in His fury. God can and does hold His anger, control His anger, never flies off the handle. Never. The Holy Spirit will give you control of getting angry. Once you get angry, you lose control. Some people will hurt and kill. Everybody who gets angry sins. Anger in people is always a negative thing. Anger in God is never a negative thing. Now, almost any time I publicly speak on anger, I have to answer two questions that somebody is sitting there thinking. The first question is, how about that verse says, be ye angry and sin not? I've already answered that. And the other one is, how about, didn't Jesus get angry? The only time in the Gospels we're clearly told that Jesus used anger was in the verse in front of you. Mark chapter 3, verse 5. It's the only time. Now, some people will say, but wasn't Jesus angry when He cleansed the temple? I have no idea. Neither do you. It may look to you like He was angry, but it does not say that He was angry. But the passage in Mark chapter 3, the context is the Pharisees could see that Jesus was about to heal on the Sabbath day a man with a withered hand. What is interesting is the complete control Jesus had of His anger. He really did nothing with it at all. It is simply stated that it was there. The verse says very simply that Jesus looked round about on them with anger, and He did nothing at all with His anger. Now, the Greek word there is orge. It is used 36 times in the New Testament, but it is never used in relation to any other person in the Bible but Jesus Himself. But the same Greek word is used in 3 different verses to tell you and me pointedly to not use anger at all. Let all, Ephesians 4:31, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. By the way, I had a pastor ask me, he said, Brother Davis, could you establish the meaning that you gave of Ephesians 4:26, be angry and sin not? Can you establish that without using the Greek? And I said, yes, I can. Now, I like using the Greek, not to correct the Bible, because the Bible doesn't need correcting, but the Greek is the best commentary you can ever get to explain, help you understand the Bible. And, but if my interpretation of Ephesians 4:26 is not accurate, then you have a contradiction between verse 26 and verse 31, because that verse says, get rid of all of your anger. And look at this verse. Colossians 3:8. In fact, read it out loud with me, everybody, would you please? But now, filthy communication out of your mouth. I was preaching in Arkansas and gave a message on anger. I think it was a different one than this one. I've got several that I actually give. And a fellow came to me after the service. He looked at me and he said, you know, I heard everything you just said. I still think a little bit of anger is all right. And you know what's funny? Bless his heart. He didn't know that he was talking with a spirit of anger when he talked to me. I mean, and people have a spirit of anger, often don't know it, but they have a spirit of anger almost all the time. I was in Denver, Colorado last year. I spoke at the homeschool convention there. And a man came up to me after one of my messages on anger. And he started talking to me about his wife and his children and all these problems he's having with his children, how his wife is telling him he needs to back off in relation to his children. And he said, he's asking me a question or two, and I realized my time was very short. I only had, a minute or two to talk to him in the spot where I was. And I said, "Sir, can I be honest with you?" He said, "Sir." I said, "Sir, you have a spirit of anger while you're talking to me right now." I said, "Your wife and family are detecting your spirit of anger all the time." I said, "If there was ever anybody who needed my anger DVDs and needed to watch them with his family, you need to get the whole set of anger DVDs. Start watching them every week with your family." To his credit, he showed up at the table later and got the whole set of anger DVDs and took them home in order to watch them. But this man in Arkansas, he's standing in front of me, and he says, "I think a little bit of anger is all right." Well, let's look at this verse here for a second. This is my answer to him. Talk to me here. Is a little bit of blasphemy all right? Is a little bit of filthy communication all right? Is a little bit of anger all right? You see it? You can't justify the anger. And James chapter 1 verse 20, "For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God." It doesn't say the wrath of man doesn't work, because it works. But it will not work the righteousness of God. It will not produce good fruit long range. Now, I do not claim to fully understand what I just shared with you. Here is the simple truth, folks. Jesus could handle anger. You and I cannot handle it. And I would suggest that you just leave it completely alone and beg God to get it moved completely out of your life. Eighth comparison between anger and unclean spirits is, many times the angry person does not see his problem, so he doesn't see the need for help. I won't just stop right there. Just let that soak in for a second. May I tell you, this is the biggest problem of all, Pastor. You got somebody with an anger problem. When I was a pastor, people would come to me and they say, "Pastor, doesn't that man know that he's got an anger problem?" And I would say to him, "No, he doesn't know he's got." "Well, how can he not know he's got an anger problem?" I had him do it with a lady. I'm thinking of a lady in particular. I had people coming to me saying, "Doesn't she know she's got an anger problem? Does she not know the problem she's creating in our church?" And Pastor, I don't know how much you've had to deal with angry people, but man, I would have somebody blow up in church, in a service or after a service or in an activity or something like that. That problem, unless that person was immediately repentant, and they seldom ever were, I don't even remember one who ever was, unless they were immediately repentant and asked everybody to forgive them, that thing would reverberate for weeks. Sometimes for months you're trying to get the unity back in the church because that one angry outburst. And people would be getting angry and offended at this person because they got angry in public at this child, or this person got angry at somebody else's child right in front of God and the world and everything. And these other people are trying to defend their child against the anger of this person. It's whoa. And the angry person refuses to see they've got a problem at all. I saw a situation where I actually detailed for a person. I said, "You manifested anger here. You threw somebody up against the wall. You manifested anger here. You screamed publicly and embarrassed a child. You manifest anger here and here and here and here." And the person looked at me and said, "I don't have an anger problem. I'm just an intense person." Well, you know what? You can't be helped. Because intensity, there's nothing wrong with intensity. And there is a problem with indignation. So intensity is fine, indignation is not. And unless you admit you got the problem, it's like an alcoholic. Preacher, the reformist groups, if a person doesn't acknowledge they've got a problem. They can't be helped. If they don't acknowledge they've got a problem, they won't even come. Unless they're willing to admit they've got a problem. The Gadarene demoniac needed help. Others had tried to chain him to help him. He would not be helped. Even when Jesus came in Mark chapter 5, the unclean spirit cried with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God that thou torment me not." Leave me alone, Jesus. When you try to help me, you're tormenting me. And unclean spirits or stubborn and angry people are often stubborn people who refuse to get any help. And Satan's deception in this area is so devastating, and often it has saved people, but they're still like they're living in the tombs with this deadness in their life from before they were saved, because we were all dead in trespasses and sins, and the anger is so much a part of the fabric of their very soul, woven into their very being. Nothing else even seems normal. Like, angry people will fight you to not leave the graveyard of their anger. And even if they do see the need to move out of the graveyard of their anger, they still like to go back and visit, unless they are continually reminded from the Word of God that anger is a tomb of death for them, not a garden of life. Now, I'm not done with my message, but you remember the opening story. I'm talking about how the angry person doesn't see his problem, doesn't see the need for help. And this missionary had spent 3 months in this area, finally pleaded guilty. The mission board ready to let him go, and the pastor was saying, "Let me counsel him." And I said to this pastor, "I'll give you a set of my anger DVDs if you would feel comfortable giving them to him." Now, the reason I said that is because we have found that a key way for people to get victory over their anger is to get the anger series. And you wouldn't believe how many testimonies. I got several testimonies this week. We had a man come up 2 days ago and said to us, "Your anger messages saved my life, saved my family. I cannot thank you enough." Another man came up an hour before him and said, "Your anger DVDs transformed our whole family." Here's the problem. You could come forward tonight, kneel at the altar and say, "God, forgive me of my anger." But it's often like an alcoholic coming and saying, "God, forgive me for drinking." And the problem is that it has become a habit that is woven into the very fabric of their being. And most people who have a habitual problem do not get victory with one quick prayer. Now, you might. Sometimes God does it, but not usually. And what we recommend is that you get the anger series and that you put it on your calendar. If you don't put it on the calendar, it doesn't get done. Put it on the calendar. Maybe it's Thursday night or Friday night or Saturday morning, and the whole family sits down and watches one of the anger DVDs. The whole family. And they talk about it after they watch it. Then next week, you watch a second one. And the next week, another one. 10 DVDs go all the way through. Takes 10 weeks. Then you start all over again. And watch them for 10 more weeks. And what will happen is the water of the Word of God will gradually wash the anger out of the family's life. Then you watch one a month to keep the anger out of the family's life. So that's why I had said that. And so this pastor friend, he said, "Brother Davis, that is a wonderful idea. I'd be delighted to send him the DVDs. I'll let you know how it comes out." I wrote that pastor, asked him how it worked out, and he wrote me this back. He said, "When I spoke with the missionary, he still denied having an anger problem. He said he's going back to the mission field with or without his church's approval, with or without support. I really felt his attitude was not conducive to being taught. He said he didn't need the DVDs, and it saddens my heart." He denied the conversation I was told took place, where his wife finally agreed that he had an anger problem, and that was why she and the children didn't want to go back to the field with her husband, why they stayed in the United States so much, because they were afraid of the husband's anger. His pastor feels he needs to resign his mission board, which he just did. I got the letter yesterday, and work on his family before he goes back to the mission field. But you know what, folks? There is no working on his family. If he will not work on his anger, there is nothing to be done. Can he solve his family problems? Not until he first deals with his anger problems. By the way, if you know who this missionary is, please don't tell anybody. My purpose is not to embarrass anyone. My purpose is simply to point out a key thought in relation to anger. Two more thoughts comparing anger and unclean spirits. At number 9, a man cannot get and keep victory over anger unless he replaces the anger. Matthew 12, when the unclean spirit is gone out of a man, he walketh through dry places seeking rest, findeth none. Then he said, I will return into my house from whence I came out. When he's come, he finds it empty, swept, and garnished. All the garbage cleaned out, nothing good put in its place. Then goeth he, taketh with himself 7 other spirits more wicked than himself. They enter in and dwell there. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. You cannot simply say, Jesus cleaned the anger out of my life and have victory. You have to replace the anger with something. And what you replace it with, notice, let all this be put out of you. And here's the replacement. Be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake. Maybe you need to put those verses on the wall. Maybe you need to come over and look at them every once in a while. This is the topic, the necessity of replacing evil with good. And now, when that stirring I talked about comes, you have to think, this is God's signal to me to let God give me patience, kindness, and gentleness. 3 big things. Say those 3 words, everybody, would you please? Patience, kindness, and gentleness. Remove that one big thorny, prickly weed of anger and replace it with the 3 lush, fragrant bushes of patience and kindness and gentleness. The Bible talks about the law of kindness. Maybe you need to put a sign up over your house that says only kindness is allowed in this home. I was at a church in the state of Washington, honest. They had it written right over the door before you walked in the auditorium. Kindness spoken here. Maybe you need to do that at your home. You need to replace the lie that anger is all right with the truth that anger is sin. You need to replace the loudness with a softness. One of the best mothers I know on the face of this earth told me how she deals when one of her children is screaming. You got a child screaming right here. Number one thing you got to do is get the child's eyes. If you don't get the child's eyes, anytime you're disciplining a child, correcting a child, talking to a child, helping a child, you got to get down on their level and get their eyes. And here's this little child that's screaming, and she's trying her best to get the eyes, and then she is saying, she's getting softer and softer and softer as she says, now, is the screaming really accomplishing anything? You know, Mommy loves you, and you've got to learn to control yourself. Can you hear Mommy talking? And she gets softer and softer and softer until she's talking in a whisper to a screaming child, and the screaming child will stop. Soft answer turns away wrath. Grievous word. You scream at a screaming child, you make the child worse. Now, here's my 10 points. Read them out loud. I'll give you my last point all together. Would you please? Number 1, there's an obvious but is shocking to those around them. Number 2, for many, their anger problem began in their youth. Number 3, an angry person may flip suddenly from being normal to displaying wrath. Number 4, loud. Number 5, the angry himself worse than anyone else. Number 6, anger sometimes causes the angry person to lose everything. Number 7, the angry person of himself and becomes controlled by his anger. Number 8, many times the angry person doesn't see his problem, so he doesn't see the need for help. Number 9, a man cannot get and keep victory over anger. And number 10, The forgiveness and deliverance of Jesus is the only true freedom for the angry person. And you know what? That's true for any other problem you and I got in life. It's all about Jesus. He is the Savior. He is the deliverer. That place, that ground you signed over to Satan. Ask God through the power of Jesus to take that ground back for Himself. Go back to that time in your life when that stirring led to sinning. Then you settled in. Then you signed over and say, dear God, I should have never given Satan that ground in my life. Jesus, in the name and through the power of your shed blood, I want you to take that ground back. The demoniac departed, began to publish in Decapolis how great things Jesus had done for him. All men did marvel. And you know what I've seen many times? Lots of testimonies about how the world is amazed when an angry person changes. You know what the world calls it? Anger management. My DVDs are played in anger management courses all over the country. I'm thrilled with it. I'm all for it. Preacher, start your own. You'd be amazed how people will come for an anger management class. And once they get here, then they find out we're not going to manage it. You don't manage sin. You get rid of sin. You get victory over the sin. And if you're lost, trust Jesus as your Savior. He is the Savior. He is the one who gives victory over any sin, that problem that you may be dealing with. I have a final newspaper article here. You don't want to miss this, all right? This is the man's picture. He's from Brazil. Enrique dos Santos, 35 years old, was trying to look like the superhero character, the Hulk, whose power is supposedly unleashed when he gets angry. He used a green paint to paint himself with, a green paint that was reserved for ballistic missiles and nuclear submarines. It started out as a little prank. He was going to paint himself like the Hulk. Now, he is staying green permanently. The comic book fan tried to scrub the glossy green in the shower, but the substance stained his skin permanently. And embarrassingly, the superhero wannabe doesn't have the power to get the stuff off. And the message is this: anger will permanently stain your life, but the blood of Jesus will cleanse you from any and all sin if you will let Him do it. Would you bow with me, please?